it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me and allowing the opportunity to discuss the IoT Security Institute, and in particular the IoT Security Institute application of the Smart Cities and Critical Infrastructure Framework. I think that probably the best place to start initially is to give a little bit of a background as to what the IoT security is and its objectives. The IoT Security Institute was developed and established for the purpose of providing and facilitating secure and safe development of IoT and IoT ecosystems. We identified that with the seismic shift towards smart technologies and the inherent cybersecurity challenges that were evolving and posing significant challenges, it was a requirement that we looked at a way by which we could facilitate a process and provide that to the cyber community in a way that can be utilized within various scenarios, in particular an IoT type security deployment. We released the framework well over 12 months ago now, and it seems to have struck a chord and has been downloaded numerous times and used in various methods and methodologies and applications to facilitate some of the best practices that have been identified. Now, I suppose many ask, what is a smart city for IoTSI, and we look upon it as very much an innovative platform that provides an inclusive, diverse, and sustainable urban environment. And with those qualities go certain responsibilities and accountabilities that people within the cyber industry are asked to manage and to address. The evolution of the framework, and why should we have a framework, was that one of the major things that have come out of the history of cybersecurity is it's constantly evolving and responding to technological as well as societal changes, and those changes are of particular interest when you start to see how communities, individuals, citizens start to become part of a technological solution or as part of some aspect of a supply chain interface. And in that, if we look at the buildings and the technologies that are associated, the traditional lines between the electrical and the mechanical have changed. The way in which we deploy, maintain, secure, update, and interface with these things have created a much more of an ecosystem in its true sense of the word, as opposed to simply a technology type solution which meets one or a few particular objectives. This is very much a seismic shift, and it's not simply a technology shift, it's a societal community shift that is bringing up certain questions on many levels. So we see that the framework addresses those issues, which include, as I said, architectures, risk, privacy concerns, and then numerous other areas where objectives meet community expectations. And the framework is designed to address the deployment of such things through a collaborative and community-based methodology. And as I progress, I'll show you that when I say community-based, I'm not simply referring to the community as citizens, but communities as working environments and working with other professionals. And you can see that in the engineering in particular and other urban planning and design activities. So I think the thing I must introduce, and one of the things that is again supports the framework, is the business case for the security by design. Now, to explain that, we all know what return on investment is, especially from a service delivery model and a technology enhancement. However, I'm sorry, I got a message. I thought we had an issue. Return on investment for smart cities or critical infrastructure is really based critically on trust models that are established from citizens and other businesses and the community at large. In other words, traditionally, we could stand up servers, we could stand up and invest in infrastructure, and providing that it wasn't knocked over, we wouldn't necessarily lose on our investment as long as the uptake was considered appropriate. In this design of security by design within smart technologies, a great deal of investment, and hence the return on that investment, is subject to society and the community's trust in what's being put forward. So if a government organisation is looking at smart governance and invests considerably, if they do not have the necessary security controls from the outset and maintain a trust with the community at large, they are at extreme risk of losing in the event of a breach or loss of personal data. So what I mean by that is that it is not difficult to rebuild a virtual environment in the cloud. It's not difficult to stand up a server that's been hacked, but it's near impossible to re-establish the trust that you require from a community or a sector of the community once that trust has been lost. So all the money you've spent on infrastructure and service delivery, if you do not have trust, then you probably won't have uptake. If you don't have uptake, you will not have the return on investment that you so desperately desire. So if we look at the framework now, we move on to somewhat of a high level, and the framework has again been released under a Creative Commons license, which is freely downloadable. It can be downloaded without any restrictions, and it's basically really a three block methodology almost, where you've got the organizational readiness component, you've got security engineering and risk analysis, and then you've got the subsequent framework reports and activities that are associated. Now, deliberately, we have looked at security by design, and the framework addresses those particular concepts through the management of components, processes, and actions. And as we move through, we can see that that's broken up in, as you can see, in the various images that are presented. Now, it's component driven, which, as I mentioned earlier, are the three key areas of the component structure of the framework. We are possibly one of the first within this space that has identified that the focus should be also very much on privacy by design. Again, I come back to the comparative of standing up a server or the models around trust. Again, this is a key shift within what we protect and what we deploy, is that at the core of all of this nuts and bolts and connectivity is effectively privacy. Privacy has stepped up into this area for obvious reasons, and is really the key focus for a lot of the activity coming out of various institutions and various businesses and corporations, be it privacy from a individual citizen's capability, the right to be anonymous, the right to be treated with a degree of respect and not simply used as a commodity, which is a critical component in this always on, always available, always communicating world that we are now living in, but also from the perspective of corporations and governments that wish to protect the privacy of their own infrastructure, their own domains of control, and still be able to maintain a democratic level of society and engagement. And of course, the architecture, we look at the fluid nature of the architecture within the framework, because, as I must point out, the framework is not a standard. The framework is a method by which to logically and progressively address cyber challenges, privacy challenges, and also map to standards that can be utilized for that. And the reason for that is because there are specific standards such as PCI DSS, various critical infrastructure standards available, 27001 and so forth, and they can be utilized within the framework. At the Institute, we are very, very mindful that many organizations have heavily invested in those risk management frameworks and architectural practices of compliance, and it would make sense to be able to utilize them in an IoT security situation deployment model. So that is something that I would particularly like to emphasize, that the ability to utilize the framework is not at the expense of what organizations may currently be having as part of their governance, risk and compliance domains. Now, breaking it down here, we can see that the components, again, we see a high level view of what the framework looks like. And as we step through this presentation, I will drill down and give you some examples of how these aspects are utilized. You can see here that we have the components, part 1, process part 2, and action plus part 3. Now, all of these are stepped through as part of an assessment process. Now, as we can see, and as I bring this out, each component is an integral part of the overall framework. And that means that it is a sequential activity in principle, although it can be done delegated at various times of a project or solutions deployment, but its methodology is very much sequential in its overall arching objectives. And we can see that as I step through these things, you see the front brings together existing controls and new cyber requirements. So this is a very much overlay of your current state. And as we move through the framework, you would eventually pull all these things together and have a visibility of your current and future states. Now, this particular section is of interest, and it's unique in understanding how cybersecurity is no longer what we used to think it was. No longer we want to set up this particular environment. This is the technology we need, and everybody in the room in some way or somehow is associated with the IT department, for want of a better word. We at the Institute realize that as we expand as a profession, cybersecurity, and as the technologies expand as part of an evolutionary process, we're going to be working with and reflected upon an array of other ways of working and other objectives on ways in which quality, ambition, objectives are determined. So for those of you that are not familiar with smart mandalas, a smart mandala is effectively where smart, and I'm using smart cities as an example here, it could be used in other contexts, but it's where we have these 6 domains, and you can see there: smart economy, mobility, environment, governance, and smart people. And each of those have got subsets. Now, when a city, like in this example, we have Nashville, but it could be any city in the world. They often use urban planners, engineers, local governments, state governments, federal, use this type of mandala to work out their priorities, their objectives, the outcomes that they need to improve the living standards of citizens, and they produce that. So we at the Institute thought this is a very good way of disseminating and pulling apart actually how a city works and how a city delivers its services, its smart services to the community, and map our framework in a way as part of a security by design methodology where we can sit at the same table with urban planners and engineers and have those discussions. And you can see in this high level, and it might be visually somewhat overwhelming if you've seen it for the first time, but effectively what it shows is the activity that goes within the urban environment, the built environment, government sectors who are designing, implementing and prioritizing smart city solutions. And they could be waste management, water management, energy, sustainability, etc. And they're looking at that and they're saying, well, how can we make our city a better place? How can we, give the citizens what they want and ultimately be a greener, more efficient, or a nicer place to live? So that's in the left-hand side of it. Now that goes, all that activity that they do is then produced and driven out of a smart city mandala. Now, all of the ins and outs of that is beyond the scope of this presentation, but it's enough to say that when a city arrives at a solution, at an ecosystem implementation, they're often using these smart city mandala models to acquire funding, acquire buy-in and endorsement. So the framework has mapped to that particular mandala and broken up each section so that security assessments, controls, and management can be factored in a language that is well understood by engineers, urban planners, government officials, and various other interested stakeholders. So if I take it down a bit lower, you will see that on the right-hand side of the screen, we have the traditional mandala, and we extract the smart governance sector, which is the yellow one, and we look at that and we run that through a case study. For example, here it's a Dubai Silicon Valley case study for smart governance activity. The IoT Security Institute framework, when applied over that mandala, is designed in such a way and is implemented in such a way that it complements and parallels the activity. So you a practitioner or someone using the framework, a cybersecurity individual, can take that governance initiative, and that governance could be, smart e-government services, e-government data for their citizens. They can take that sector, understand the rationale, understand the service model, understand the architectures, and apply the framework over that component or numerous components, enabled to really provide a security and privacy by design from the outset. Now that looks quite complicated potentially, but really all it's doing is mapping and assessing as the process for the smart city develops. So it allows for interfaces that normally under a traditional cyber model would not be there. And it would be very difficult for cybersecurity people to sit in on these conversations at the government urban design level. And again, let me extrapolate upon that. And this image gives you a better understanding potentially what is done. And that is, we can see that above the woman's finger there, there's that governance model, and it's a synergistic collaboration effectively. And that means that the two mandalas, or the two areas of development, in this context, the cyber team and the design team for smart solutions, are working together. And this has been proven very positive because it allows, as I said earlier, for mapping milestones and updates and reflections of changes in direction and solution over an architectural or design principled methodology for urban development. And now that you can see that basically what we're showing is that we have two interested parties in this particular area that are working together. Now, to put that to you again in a methodology, it's not easy to simply say, well, these are the things you have to, these are the things we're looking to do. The framework and the Institute realizes that a great deal of what is done, be it internally or via external parties, is through the consultant engagement model or the consultative process. And that means that irrespective of what you're doing and who you're doing it with, from a cybersecurity perspective, the framework says, well, we need a way by which people who are facilitators can work through and develop the cyber controls and snapshots in a manner which is reflective of how we work and how business and corporations and governments work in general. So this illustration here shows that, if you remembered the original step, you see organizational readiness is the kickoff point of phase one. It moves through risk control documents, privacy and data protection, building information modeling, etc., etc. And that is the life cycle of the smart cities and critical infrastructure framework. And all of those activities are worked through in conjunction with stakeholders, third-party developers, engineers, urban planners, to ascertain finally the overall report, which is a presentation that captures all of that input and presents it to the client or the government sector exactly what is and will be and what the challenges are by comparing the various sources of input. And finally, you'll see that big green tick, and that's the cybersecurity project sign off. Now, it's a good point at this point to introduce, to say that all of this information is available on the IoT Security Institute website. All of the documentation can be downloaded. The overview documents, all of that goes into far more detail than what I could possibly go into now. But this is designed primarily to show you the model and the process flows for the activities that I've been speaking of previously. And I'll give an example as we move on that's a little bit more reflective. So on that point, we're looking at the framework delivery model. And again, if you recall, we had three key components: the organizational, the posture, engage and deploy. Well, those aspects are still very relevant as part of that development model. So if we work through that, let's have a look at a smart parking example. The smart parking example is usually a good way to go because it brings in numerous considerations. Now, when we take our organizational readiness against the smart parking model, we conduct an assessment of where the organization is currently within their security posture, within their maturity. Put another way, an organization that wants to introduce smart parking that's tied to role-based access controls or tied to various user groups and so forth, how are they currently doing things? How well are they doing them? What's their threat exposure? In other words, are they at a level that they need to first take care of their own current state before they can even consider some of the IoT smart technologies? Which, if you look at logically, makes sense that they already have an existing IT model. They already have an IT strategy, department, capabilities, resources. What is their current profile? It's futile to want to introduce IoT smart technologies into an organization that has a very poor security posture to begin with. It's really working backwards. And this is the first assessment is really about determining the current state, and then as you work through, understand what the target state is. And then you have an action plan associated with that. So if we look at it from that perspective and break it down in terms of the framework, we can see that as we work through the framework and the various components, we address areas around asset classification. We look at the risk assessment and profiles associated with the current state and the target state. We look at a gap analysis between the two. As I mentioned earlier, your current state is X, and you wish to do all of these new things. How do they overlay? Where do they complement? And where is there a gap that needs to be very well managed and developed? Now, that then brings us down to the threat modeling component of such a framework, where we break down this IoT solution, we break down all of the various layers to determine exactly how we do this. And now with the IoT security industry, when we talk about risk assessments and the threat modeling activities, we worked with Carnegie Mellon University, who were working on a security-based scenario model, which was far more applicable to a very complex environments that had various systems of interest and means by which to attack and breach services, as opposed to a very presumptuous almost methodology of some risk assessments, which put something in and get something out based on a criteria. Their model is far more scenario based, where you will see as I progress how that's applied. And that's, I think, a critical component of any assessment against IoT security. And of course, that also works with the use cases, very much so, where the risk assessment and scenarios works against the use cases for the IoT solution. And finally, all of that is then looked upon from an IoT reference architecture perspective. All works well, we have our solution, we move on. Now again, the building services threat modeling is as you would have noted in the previous slide, is a very critical area. And this is something that the threat modeling is sometimes overlooked in numerous implementations, perhaps because it's poorly understood, or perhaps it historically is being done by a small percentage of people. But certainly within an IoT world where we have this omnipresence and continual connectivity and aggregation of data, and as I said, by its very nature, to be successful, it has to be transparent and it has to be facilitate convenience or benefit. So that's an incredible challenge when you're trying to secure an environment, but at the same time not be in a position where you actually eliminate the convenience that it delivers. So that's again a very pivotal point. So with threat modeling within a framework, it's a very important aspect, and you can see those 1 to 6 points that that take all of those and become part of the overall assessment of the proposed solution. Now, then we look at within the threat modeling, we also look, obviously, we do work with the system architecture and we get into the complexities of what that actually means. So at this point, it's probably worth introducing the concept that the cybersecurity professional at this point now is not responsible for all of this. They are the cybersecurity facilitator. So the IoTSI framework, and as you saw in that process flow, engages with and obtains information and input from an array of services, an array of resources. So within the framework as a process, a cyber professional will be working with system engineers, developers, etc., and understanding and putting to them the requirements for a security by design process, in effectively being the orchestra, the orchestra master, so to speak, the conductor for this activity, so that all areas are covered. And I think that's an important thing to put through, irrespective of whether you take a percentage of a particular activity. The importance here in working with engineers, builders, governments, etc., is to ensure as cyber professionals all areas are considered, a position has been considered, and then we move on. One of the major concerns at the moment with IoT, IoT, etc., is that the functionality and the convenience is so overwhelming that it cannot be a bad thing. And a lot is overlooked as part of the assessment and deployment development process because it's not thought of as we would traditionally within a data center at a company somewhere. We're talking about a distributed service here that can cover an array of interfaces. And unless all of them are considered, then we really are not doing very well at all. And this is where we have to say, again, look at use case scenarios. So again, we break down everything that the solution will do. And this is, this is where we can look at it traditionally from a technical perspective. Oh, okay, we have a registered customer, we have an unregistered customer, we have a system admin. They're roles. And we map those roles and we understand what the systems of interest are, what the data concerns are, data loss concerns are, all of the traditional stuff that we all do day to day. But over this and within a smart cities context, we can also look at each one of those use cases and look at what the privacy requirements are, what the citizen utilizing this service is expecting from it. How much of themselves do they have to give to be able to log on, and is that reasonable within a community expectation? So I say this so that we can understand it again from my introduction, that the work we do now as cyber professionals is not simply a case of securing something, but actually in protecting citizens themselves. And there's another conversation here around how much do we collect to be efficient, and what are the responsibilities and the legal requirements. All of these can be fleshed out, and I'm quite comfortable to say that this is work that many of you already are doing and many of you are already very mindful of. But this is simply a process that helps facilitate that activity, and it helps facilitate the conversation with those. And I'm sure you meet many people every day that don't quite understand what we do, and consider us to be perhaps even almost intrusive. So a framework has multiple functions that help us achieve an outcome. And again, we can see that there. If I look back, it's just pretty much a standard analysis risk assessment. We've all seen these sort of processes before. But then in this particular side of the detail thing, and you can see we break down to the devices. Now, we've stepped through a whole array, but also within the framework is very mindful of the security of devices, their manufacture, their capability to be upgraded, their capability to be secured in a manner which is considered a bare minimum. And this is a very important area of the overall framework. And again, we come back to the conversation of security by design, because if you're not there from the beginning, you're not there at all. Let's be honest. I mean, the previous presenter talked about the millions of instances, and we all know that we're talking billions of people. Billions of devices servicing the needs of people. It's impossible. Once it gets away from you, I don't know anybody that can really pull it in. So this is where a framework puts device selection, procurement, analysis through the security machine. It's almost like you're buying something and you need to ensure that the security of that component is sufficient for what you want to do. And again, my argument that there are multiple interfaces and you can come undone at any point. So as an example, a procurement of devices in the thousands can be cheap and very nasty, but as far as the procurement department is concerned, they bought the necessary devices that have the necessary sensors, and they bought them very cheaply and effectively. From a security perspective, now that could go straight through and no one would question it until there were all sorts of problems. But from a framework assessment report perspective, the devices themselves are assessed and qualified fit for purpose or not. So although you're a cybersecurity professional and you're not directly manufacturing the devices, or you're not part of that process, the framework makes it incumbent upon the manufacturers to meet baseline requirements. And that's a very, very critical area. And many of us have seen just what happens when you buy the cheapest thing on the shelf and think you've done yourself a great service. So the outputs of the framework and its activities will drive external processes and requirements, and that's the constant theme throughout the framework within smart cities and critical infrastructure. The outputs are what we are looking for, and the outputs will determine the maturity of our environment and equally the maturity of our understanding of what we're doing. If we need to be able to do that, and as cyber professionals, a great deal more responsibility is going to come upon us, because the effect that you get from a breach when you're talking about smart technologies that touch upon healthcare, public safety, critical infrastructure, in a world that communicates within seconds when there's been a breach, is putting a lot of pressure. And as I come back to that argument about trust, once you lose the community's trust, it's very difficult to get back. So we have to walk a very, very detailed line. And what comes out of that is the outputs allow us to actually break down and have conversations across the spectrum. So one would be vendor engagement. That could be, as I said, around devices and infrastructure, the management of that vendor. That will feed into the procurement process and what is the selection process of such an activity. And that will also feed into the reference architecture. The subcomponents of the architecture will be, as the outputs of that activity will drive the above, which will at the end affect the reference architecture overall. So to be able to understand that is to understand a holistic view of technology controls that are in place and how you do those. And I think from a cyber professional, again, I repeat, we are talking about millions of devices and God knows how many sensors. So that we are not talking one sensor on a door, we're talking thousands. And so again, this process needs to be very well documented and captured from the outset. Now, as I progress, I told you earlier that the framework and the mandala were aligned, and equally, again, because we are outside the data center now, we're outside of our own family, let's say, right? So we're working with other families who look at the world differently, have different objectives, have different ways of rationalizing or not. And engineers is an interesting one for the cyber professional. Now, the cyber in the built environment is a real case of working with engineers and many to go into. So if you're building an entertainment complex or working with a smart hospital or working with critical infrastructure development, what we're talking about here, cybersecurity is just one of the many things that is going on. And if you look at this, we see that planning, design, procurement, construction, operations is a life cycle for engineers within the built environment. It's not one within the cyber necessarily. So the framework and the mandala and the mappings and collaboration models really start to come into some sort of fruition when you start talking to people that wear hard hats or design engineers, because you're part of the beginning. So if we look at this, let's have a look at the engage and deploy model. This is how an engineering company looks at, a building and construction company looks at what they do and how they do it. So you see their initial building concept and designs, their detailed technical designs. Now, from a cyber perspective and security by design and coming in at the build and design and build stage, we see some of the activities that we're looking at that can be fleshed out and processed through a framework through various engagements. So again, you'll see familiar concepts like strategic objectives, cybersecurity design consideration, initiate cyber framework, establish key cyber team. This is part of the kickoff process of any large project, but we have representatives in cybersecurity that are part of that design process. So, and then as that moves on into a technical design, that again continues to develop and engage. So if we look at consistently manage risk exposure, I mean, what does that mean? That means that in a traditional sense, we build a platform and we utilize the cloud, and we've got our employees using this, and we understand, and that's what it is at the beginning, and that's pretty much what it's going to be at the end. When you're working with engineers and building and construction teams and people who pour concrete, there might be a design change in the building itself. The physical perimeters might change. The location of particular devices, communication devices, might move from the original plan, which ultimately will affect the security profile or exposure. If we move data comms or access points or an array of other activities to a different physical location because it was deemed better from a design perspective. If we're not aware of that change, if we're not part of that continual development, then the cyber is affected by that. And be it at a physical security level or be it at a technological security level. So that's just a brief example of that. And as we move on to the built environment, and I appreciate there's a lot of information here and it's all available on the website that you can go through at your leisure and see what the documents actually are. But the concepts are the same. And the concept is that, again, now we're looking at, the built environment design, and we start to shape things out more and more in the validated documentation and in the operational environments that come out of engineering concepts and design engineering, be it mechanical, electrical, HVAC, audio, visual, all of these things it all starts to pull together as part of a solution, and it's the operational environment is defined. And again, the managing the supply chain is a transition from design to construction. So now we are now in the physical world, that all of the previous work we've done, or the city has done, is now in the production, actual physical world. It's actually being built. As part of the subcontractor, they may have little understanding of the control, the key vulnerabilities and design decisions. Again, comes back to my point about the change of a physical design, the location of a particular piece of infrastructure, constantly changing in the built environment. So this is where the framework and ultimately the conclusion of a very large project in this smart city context moves on through not a cybersecurity model. It moves through a design and build. So it's design, build, run a physical piece of infrastructure with associated smarts. So again, as cyber professionals in the future, in this next generation of cyber professionals, will be working with these people, whereas people from 20 years ago never worked with these people or rarely touched base with them. The future for cyber professionals will be, on site as much as off site, and working with engineers as much as working with system administrators. So in this final one, we can see the monitoring design integrity. This is where in a built environment, there's that assessment, that review of the requirements, ensuring everything works. Very complicated, very, very labor intensive, and touching so many interfaces. And again, in this concept of the cybersecurity model, where do we sit as cyber individuals? And that's very important, because if our elevators are smart, if our parking's smart, if our lighting is smart, if we understand each other, everything is smart, everything can be compromised, everything can be ransomed, everything can affect public health and safety. So again, we are critical as much as any other component of a smart city design principle. And that again comes to the project handover from cybersecurity. And it's a critical point. It's where the cybersecurity brings all of that together and acknowledges that the built environment has met its obligations throughout a process that could take, 3 years to build, 2 years to build again. Now, this is on that point, and this is something that I want to make quite clear. Smart cities are increasingly being addressed and are required to meet continual evolution of security, legal and regulatory requirements. It's obvious for the reason. However, we are still at a point now where there is nothing you can see from those examples, but they're quite generic in the context of what I'm about to say. It is my opinion, and it's the opinion of the Institute, that because of the nature of smart technology, the nature of business and government services, the nature of protecting one's IP, research, public and private security, that eventually all buildings will be certified for cybersecurity the same way that they are certified for fire extinguishers or sprinkler systems, and every floor has a defibrillator, these sorts of things, where 100 years ago we never thought about that. But today you can't build a building without obviously having all the various safety systems in place to protect the tenants. And we believe that, and in conversation, that capability and capacity will move into into cities and critical infrastructure. When I say critical infrastructure, I'm not simply talking about gas plants or nuclear power plants, and that critical in terms of criticality to the community. And that can be a hospital operating room. That's critical. If you're on that operating table and everything goes, that's life at risk here. And the buildings are starting to become such hubs of humanity that we need at some point to certify that what we're doing and what is protecting and in accordance. And it's not simply safety. If you're a research and development company and you're sharing an office in a building and it is a smart building, if it's not properly certified by the owners or the department running it, you could be easily breached and have your IP stolen and your business is no longer there. or if you're developing critical blueprints or providing building information, building modeling services, etc., to a defense department or something else, you are part of that extension. Is that building certified to a cybersecurity level that provides the level of protection that the tenant would require? I think today you'd be pushed to go into any building and have that answered for you, be it the access at the door or be it the systems that support the network. Moving on, and I'm very mindful for those who have remained, it's been a long day, and I'm in the morning here and you're late at night there, so I'm nearly over. But I just wanted to introduce one of the things that the IoT Security Institute has also developed as to augment and to develop the activities that we work, is that we have established a campus, and a campus provides certification for smart cities, smart city critical infrastructure professionals from a security perspective, obviously. And that's where all of what I've spoken about and the industry and the various certification programs are offered for those that are interested. And it's, again, reflective of where the industry is going, what government is looking for in the next generation of cyber professionals, what critical infrastructure is looking for. So I thought I'd share that with you if you at all wanted to learn more about that. And you're obviously through the IoTSI in Chile, pretty much. I can provide you with information about that and the various other chapters that may be here, or you can get more information from online, obviously. I mean, we, as an organisation, as a body, the IoTSI welcomes industry partnerships and collaboration with all, and we have some wonderful relationships where we share and collaborate and develop ideas and opportunities. We have an extensive IoTSI chapter network that people can get involved or start their own chapters and various other things, but we are very open and we are very interested in pushing things through. And to summing up, and again, thank you for taking the time. The future for smart urban planning, will usher in an era, and has ushered in an era of creativity, functionality, and convenience, really resulting in unprecedented opportunities. And it's moving very, very quickly. And hence, for those cyber professionals that have an interest in that space, I mean, a very good career ahead, I would suggest. But we do have a considerable responsibility, and a responsibility that is extended beyond simply protecting hardware and software, but effectively a responsibility that requires us to protect and reflect the best interests of our community and of its citizens. So on that point, I thank you again very much for taking the time to listen to this fellow from Australia, and I hope you get the opportunity to come and visit the IoT Institute website. If you have any questions, we're more than happy to address them, and thanks again.
Okay, thank you, Alan. They're very interesting speak. I don't know if you hear me now. Al público, muchas gracias por escuchar a Alan. Ya fue una interesante exposición. Si tienen algunas preguntas, por favor, vayan haciéndola al chat. Nosotros se la vamos a estar transmitiendo a Alan. Alan, okay. You can hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay. Now, very interesting speak.
Thank you.
A good for me is all new, or the smart city for me is new, but it's very interesting.
Yes.
We are waiting if some guy have a question.
Sure.
Comment in the chat, so we can
happy to answer it. Happy to answer any questions.
Okay.
And of course,
yeah.
Hello, Rudy.
Now Now in Australia it's in the morning, so you have all the day to stay. We are now it's 9 p.m.
Wow, I know. It's very, very kind of you to stay awake. Well, not stay awake, but at least you'll be working. Let's put it that way.
Yeah. So for there is Saturday, so
Okay.
uh, okay. Rudy Benochet say hi, Alan. The Carlos Ezequiel say a good exposure.
Yes,
So,
yes. Thank you. I just want to remind you that everything that I covered today can be obtained and downloaded and worked with at your convenience. So if you wish, I mean, I'm very mindful that there's a lot of detail and things to comprehend and think with, but it's all available online at the IoTSI. You can see framework.iotsi. That'll take you straight to the framework page, and you can download everything you like. Well, Alan, what do you know about Julio? Well, I work very closely with Freddie Marcher and numerous other people out of the region. So through the chapters and through association, and I see that it's a very, very progressive and area of cybersecurity. I see that the effects on the economy within Latin America around what 5G is looking to present and the new technologies on how they will affect an array of government services and regional services, I think is really driving the cybersecurity and smart technology sectors. Of course, we've all been hurt by COVID, and everything's come to a stop. But I believe that once that comes over, the economic developments that smart security will bring in that region, and from the feedback I've received from people in the region that know it far better than I do, seems to substantiate that belief.
okay, we have another question from Rudy Binochet.
Yeah.
Hi, Alan. What another research and framework are you currently developing on these topics?
Other research frameworks are currently developed on these. Well, we're interested in developing more. Like for example, we've got the IoTSI there, Smart Cities and Critical Infrastructure Framework, which is applicable, as I said, as a framework and reference model, so it's very adaptable. But we would like to look at healthcare, particularly healthcare, and really focus something on healthcare, because that is an area of extreme development of that and has such a possibility, but at the same time, very unique challenges. I gave the example of medical services effectively. So it would be nice to research, and there has been some activity and develop frameworks specific to, not specific, but factoring in the language of the healthcare industry.
Okay, and from the last question from Sebastian Varga, what is the recommended route of CSSISP certification?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that there are two SCCISP certifications available. There are others that are specific to maritime, and there are 5G. But in terms of SCCISP, the difference between the associate course, SCCISP associate course is for those who have no or little experience in security, but wish to develop a career and position themselves for the type of work and activities that I was talking about in smart cyber, let's call it. And the SCCISP Foundation is really for those that have had more than 5 years experience in cybersecurity and are looking to get that high level. But to find out about that and to understand in detail what it's about, the best thing to do is to go to scisp.org putting it up here. Hopefully Oscar can share it. And that will show you the portal, the campus, all the available courses, and the points of entry.
Okay. And from Andres Mora, he writes in Spanish, but I translate. Any special requirement to be able to take that certification?
No. As I said previously, the SCCISP associate course can be taken by anyone because it takes you through and introduces you to the smart cyber, industrial control systems, etc., without a presumption that you have to have X number of years experience or various other things. However, having said that, it's quite extensive and it is very much deployment and industry based. So the courses are not academic in the sense that they're a white paper. They're actually designed in a way that you can apply what's in there. And one of the key components to both SCCISP courses is that part of it is the IoTSI framework. And the framework that I presented today, there are case scenarios and assignments associated. So when you achieve it, you can actually apply it within industry. But to answer the question, the associate course is for anyone. The foundation course requires that you have at least 5 years cybersecurity because it is more detailed and there's more of a requirement from a more senior person.
Okay. Okay, we are going to have more questions. So from name of the directors of SCCISP Foundation, we are very grateful from your very tremendously speed. Where we hope to keep in touch in the future. Thanks very much. So, and nice to meet you, Alan.
Thank you very much, Oscar. It's been a pleasure, and thank you to everyone. I understand it's late in the day, so I appreciate that even more. So again, yes, let's keep in touch, and if anybody wishes to join up and for free at the site and take advantage of all that activity, they're more than welcome. And again, thank you very much for your time, and thank you to the organisers. I think you've done a wonderful job. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Alan. Bye. Have a good day.
See you. Bye-bye.